Evening, guys. Welcome to our class tonight. Hopefully, everybody's getting online here and getting ready to go. We are ready for lesson 7 tonight, and we're going to be looking at Abraham becoming a great nation. And this, remember, we're doing a survey of the Old Testament, so we're picking up kind of a highlight in a line here of history in the Old Testament, really following at this point the seed line promise from Genesis chapter 3. And we're going to be talking about that as we talk about the development of a nation from the promises made to Abraham that we looked at last week. Let me just start off before we get into anything real deep tonight. Just make sure everybody can hear me okay. Glad to see some pop in here. Good to see Shayna with us tonight. That's great. And of course, all of our students here. I see Russell and Julie and Tiffany and Timothy. So glad to see everybody tonight. Let me do a couple things before we go to the PowerPoint as everybody's getting on here tonight. We've been looking at a series of thoughts from the Old Testament that surround the history of mankind and the history of God and mankind. In other words, the history that God has shared not only to mankind but with mankind. And we saw the garden, we saw creation actually first. I talked about the flood a little bit in a different way, but we've talked about Abraham. When we talked about a promise made both in the garden and then kind of remade to Abraham about this seed that's going to bless the families of the earth. And with that promise made to Abraham was kind of two promises related to the nation of which would be the nation of Israel, nation of Judah, and they were the nation promise, and the promise of blessing all the families of the earth, and the land promise. And those things are what we're going to start to look at tonight. Next week, we're going to be talking about the giving of the law, the Old Testament law, the law of Moses. So that just kind of catches us up where we're at. Let me go ahead and slide over here to our PowerPoint, and there we go. We're talking, again, like I said, we're talking about the making of a nation. And where we left off last week was this promise made by God to Abraham that he would have his descendants would number the sand of the sea. And another retelling of it, they would be as numerous as the stars of the sky. And that all the nations would be blessed from the seed of Abraham. And of course, Abraham was asked to leave his home. He was asked to leave everything he knew. He was a sojourner, if you would, following what God or where God would lead. And all he had to do and to base all this on was his faith and his trust in God. Of course, the Hebrew writer picks up on that as an example of what faith is in Hebrews 11. But this is an important part of who we are as a Christian family today. We are sons and daughters of Abraham, Genesis chapter 3, which was part of our discussion last week. And we become family with Abraham, sons and daughters, through the promise made and through the answering of that promise, the giving of the answer to that promise, which is Jesus the Christ. So let's go ahead and start, and I'm going to apologize for if I have to clear my throat a little bit tonight. These allergies are getting to me already this year, so a little scratchy and so forth. I apologize for that. Week 7, that's where we're at, lesson 7. If you're in the classroom, if you've been doing the classroom work with us, there is no accompanied articles. There hasn't been in a couple weeks because I'm really interested in you looking at the text that surrounds these lessons and being familiar with it, because that's where the richness of the ties that we're going to build going forward, as well as just generally in our faith. Knowing our history and being able to tie concepts to that is really why we're doing this Old Testament survey, kind of lay a floor, if you would. You're required to answer the discussion question, especially credit students, reply to at least 2 of your classmates. And if you're not a credit student, and Russell's been really good doing this, brag on him a little bit here, but we still want to encourage you, even if you're an audit student, to be a part of that discussion, because that's really where we and you guys get the chance to interact with some of these things and learn from each other and learn from your own study and challenge some things you might see. So really want to encourage you to be a part of the discussion if you're able. And for the credit students, you should be at this point, you should have established which avenue you're going to go on that research paper, and you should be starting to outline that paper. It's only going to be a few weeks before it's due. It will be due the week after our last class closes, so keep that in mind if you're a credit student. All right, on to the good stuff tonight. We're talking about making a nation from this man and woman. You have Abram and Sarah where we left off, and they haven't even been called kind of renamed yet with that H on the end there, Abraham and Sarah instead of Sarai. But there is a significance there. We're not going to get into that tonight. But there's a lot of stuff that we're going to skip over. And it's not because it's not important. It's just because we are trying to trace this line to know our history in these matters. And I would really encourage you to go back if you have the extra time to look at those things in your own study. So for instance, we're going to talk here in a moment about the promised son. And I would encourage you to go back and look at the story of Hagar and Ishmael, where Abraham and Sarah decide they're going to try to help God out, and it ends up in a big mess. And that's usually the case. There's also Abraham's lie as he goes into Egypt, as well as the same lie when he deals with Abimelech. So there's a lot of things that we're not going to cover that would be a good thing to go back and study. But anyway, on to our lesson for tonight. We are tracking that seed line promise, and that's what I've already said, but just to reiterate that, from now the garden to Abraham, and then from Abraham forward. But first, let's talk about this son of promise. And if you have a Bible, and that would be great. I'm not going to throw one up here. The main verses we're looking at are going to be in the PowerPoint though. But we're in Genesis 21. This is after the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is after the instance with Ishmael and Hagar. But here comes God, and he is actually going to fulfill the promise he has made. Both Sarah and Abraham are older. And when I say older, we're going to find out that Abraham was 100 years old when Isaac is born. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Sarah is like 80 years old. And, that's, even with modern medicine, that's just not really a combination that bodes well for having a child. But God said they would, and that's what God does. So let's read this little text together, starting in verse 1. It says, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken. For Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time of which God had spoken to him. And Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. And then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. And now Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him." There is so much that we can kind of get into in discussion here, but there are a couple things that I just want to make a passing mention to. Knowing who's in the class tonight, I know these things aren't new to you, but just to kind of bring them back up in your mind, your own study. The very first comments made here are so important. It says, "And the Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had spoken." And that's something very, very important to keep in mind when we talk about God. God keeps his word. Now, sometimes his word has conditions. If we flash forward a little bit from where we're at in our text, and we get to a little bit, a couple hundred years, so several hundred years, the delivery of the children of Israel out of Egypt and into the wilderness and so forth. God made a promise, and we call it the promise of blessing and cursing. And he promised that if they walked with him and they worshiped him and only him, that he would bless them, And if they walked away from him and they didn't follow him, that he would curse them. So he kept his word. When they walked away from him, he cursed them. When they walked with him, he blessed them. So God is a God of covenant. Now, we like to say that, or I like to say that. But God is one who keeps his word. And this is just one of those reminders to us that that is true. It's something we can see time and time again in the Old Testament. And it should bolster our own faith that when God has made a promise to us, that he will never forsake us, that he will always be with us. The end of the Great Commission, for instance, and he's going to do what he said. That if we walk with him, that if we are in his son, that we're going to see the blessing of heaven and all that it has to offer. He's going to deliver what he said. So that is, obviously something we could develop a lot deeper, but something just to keep in mind from this text. As related to our study, this is the promise. And look at the picture here. You have an older gentleman and an older lady who have now born a son, but God has promised him that all the nations of the world are going to be blessed through him. And they don't even have a place to call home. They're wandering around Canaan at this point, pitching their tent, taking care of their animals, moving on to the next place where they can find enough pasture for their animals to graze, and so on and so forth. Nothing in the physical world would say that this family, this little bitty family, this oddball family, if you would have any chance of impacting the world. And yet it is through them that God has chosen to change the world. And that is another powerful lesson to keep in mind. We see limits in our physical world. God doesn't. God is outside our physical world, and he can use what we have as long as we're willing to give it to him to be used. I said a lot there in a little short bit of time. So let me just throw this out there. If you're still with me, if you can kind of let me know that we're still coming through pretty clear, or somebody there in the chat, that would be great. And then we're going to move on following this promise as we go forward from Abraham to Isaac to Jacob and into Egypt. Again, we're covering just this main kind of line of history. And we're going to be passing over a lot of really good text. And please take the encouragement to go back and study those. All right. In Genesis chapter 26, now we are fast forwarding, and we're talking about this promise and this covenant. We talked last week about the making of the covenant, and talked about the splitting of the animals and that God had passed through them. And if you went back and studied, which we didn't look, but I encourage you to, the Jeremiah context, you would know that in kind of the ancient ritual, two people would pass through. The people making the covenant would pass through the similar idea. But in Abraham's case, it's only God that passed through. And that's significant because, like I said last week, and we'd like to reiterate here, this covenant is based on the one who can deliver it, which is God. It has conditions for Abraham and his family and his descendants, but they're not equal partners in this. And I've brought this up in different texts, or in different venues, but let me bring it up here. If we enter into a contract with someone in our modern day, we're kind of looking for a symbiotic relationship, or at least a relationship where both parties are bringing something of somewhat equal value. So when we sell a house and we enter a contract to sell that house, we are bringing our house to that deal, and they are bringing a sum of money to that deal that we feel are somewhat equal, or at least to our favor. Abraham comes to this covenant with nothing. He is nothing. He is without God. He has nothing. Without God, he is nothing. Go back all the way to the garden. From dust you came, to dust you return. That's all we are without God. So this is God's covenant. Now, he made it with them, but all the value of it is found in God. And that's something to keep in mind. Again, when you flash forward to Jesus' day, and they were saying, but we are sons of Abraham. and he says God can raise up sons of Abraham from these rocks. They were counting something that Abraham would know wasn't to be counted. It wasn't about Abraham, it was about the God he served. And they had missed that message somewhere. They thought they were of value in this relationship because of who they were, when actually they had value because of who God was. So anyway, the covenant then is not just with Abraham, but rather his descendants, working its way down eventually to Jesus. Genesis chapter 26. And then we enter into Isaac's life. Obviously, we passed a lot. We passed Mount Moriah and the sacrifice of Isaac, or the attempted. We passed a lot of stuff here. But Genesis 26, we see God now extending that same promise and covenant from Abraham now to Isaac. It says here, starting in verse 2, Then the Lord appeared to him and said, Do not go down to Egypt. Live in the land which I shall tell you. Dwell in this land, and I will be with you and bless you. For to you and your descendants I give all these lands, and I will perform the oath which I swore to Abraham your father, and I will make your descendants multiply as the stars of heaven. I will go to give to your descendants all these lands, and in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed, because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. Again, there's a lot in this little bit of text. The main thing for us to see, and then we'll talk about some sub things, the main thing is this continuation of the promise. Abraham's kind of coming off the scene. Isaac is now picking up the leadership of his family, and God reiterates to him what he promised to Abraham. I'm going to give you these lands. There are a couple of interesting things here. It was already told to Abraham that they would go into Egypt, and he makes specific mention here not to go to Egypt. It is not time for them to go to Egypt yet. And the reason why I think that's there is twofold. One, there's a temptation sometimes, remember Abraham, to try to help God out. So if God said, Abraham's going to have a child and they weren't going to have a child, Abraham tried to figure out another way to have a child. There was this promise and it involved going to Egypt. Maybe Isaac would thought, I'll just kind of fast forward and just go on to Egypt. That may have been it. I don't know. Most likely, though, it has to do with the fertility of Egypt, the land of Goshen and the Nile River, and they always seem to have resources. And in times of famine, that's where people would go. Obviously, that'll play a larger part here as we go when we hit Joseph and then Jacob's family. But he says, I'm going to give all these things I promised to your father. I'm going to give them to your descendants. And that's really key. And then you have this last part with all these my statements. Because this is the reason why he's giving these things to the descendants. Because Abraham obeyed my voice and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. Now, I just said a minute ago that Abraham came with nothing. And he had no value to offer God, but God came with all the value. Really, that's being reiterated here. Isaac has no value here. It's because of God, and now he invokes Abraham as the reason why he's being blessed is because of what Abraham did. Abraham kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, my laws. So again, it's not a place where Isaac can say, I have these things from God because I deserve them. It's because someone else before him paved the way. And so it is with us. We have these blessings in God because Christ before us paved our way. There's a nice little parallel there. There's also something else there that's a little side note. My descendants, I want to be really careful with this because their actions still, have a lot to do with this. But they can reap the benefit of my walk with God. And that's easy to see. If I walk with God and I, diligently seek after Him, they have an example before them. They have something that they can grow in and see and learn from themselves. So, though we don't have this specific covenant made with our family here, the practicality is still there. That my sons, my daughter can benefit from my faithfulness. And so those other parents that might be students here, that's true for you too. And that's really true for anybody, whether you have kids or not, because we all impact someone in that way. All right, so here's the main piece of this. God says, I'm going to keep this covenant not just because of Abraham, but I'm giving it to you, Isaac. So when Abraham leaves the scene, the covenant is not null and void because it's not made just with Abraham, it's made with his descendants. Now we're going to jump again. We're going to jump to chapter 28. There's not a whole lot said about Isaac. There's some about how he takes his wife and so forth. Just say he repeats the sin of Abraham with a man named Abimelech. And I don't know if it's the same or a son. There's some debate there, but not a whole lot is given about Isaac's life, actually. About a whole lot said about Jacob. But Jacob in Genesis chapter 28, dropping down to verse 13, it says, And behold, the Lord stood above it and said, I am the Lord God of Abraham your father, and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie I will give to you and your descendants, and also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west, and to the east, and to the north, and to the south, and in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Now again, the wording isn't exactly the same, but the ideas are exactly the same, aren't they? The descendants spreading and numerous, the blessing of all the earth. This is a really cool text that we're not going to have time to get into tonight, where Jacob is wrestling with God. But the point for our kind of history walkthrough here is that, again, Isaac got the covenant promise renewed, Jacob gets the promise renewed. And again, it's to your descendants. And through your descendants, these blessings will be seen and that they will be obtained. So we have this picture here of God who has, not only in the garden said, I love you enough, my creation, that I'm not going to just kind of shut this thing down, but I'm going to make a promise. I'm going to bring someone forth, the seed that's going to restore this relationship, it's going to crush the serpent and so forth. He picks Abraham to be that bearer of that promise, that seed line, and then Isaac and Jacob as we see that family move forward. All right. Let me kind of pause there for a second. If you have any thoughts you want to bring up, I want to go back to a thought that was posted by Tiffany in the chat. She says something about God being beyond our physical limits. Nothing controls him and his abilities. It's a constant picture in the Old Testament. Nobody is beyond God, whether it is beyond its reach or whether it's beyond its power or whether it's beyond anything. And nobody is beyond God. In our Bible study, we were talking about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel 3. And, he makes this proud and arrogant as Nebuchadnezzar's statement that, what God can deliver you. He's talking about once I throw you in the fire, you're done. And in Abraham and Nebuchadnezzar's view, he was bigger than any god there was because he had already defeated all the lands. And in their thinking of the ancient world, if I defeat you, that means my God or I am bigger than your God that defends your land. So he thought in his mind, hey, he was the real big deal. And he, of course, learns that God is far beyond his power. And he'll learn that better in Daniel chapter 4, actually. But he sees that in the fire when he sees the fourth that's like the Son of God. All right, so we have this promise made to Abraham, made to Isaac, made to Jacob. And it's something to remember when you read through the Old Testament, you hear God refrain, I am the God of your fathers, Abraham, Jacob, Isaac, and Jacob. This is why. It's that recurring of that covenant promise. In other words, any Hebrew who heard that knew what God was alleging and knew who the God was who was alleging it. In other words, it's the God, the covenant keeping, the covenant promising, the covenant delivering God that says these things or does these things, whatever the context might be. All right. Now, a lot is going to happen between where we just left off and Genesis 46. And I'm going to recap it really, really quickly, and then we're going to move forward because we're looking at how this little family became this nation, and there's some really big stories here that we're just not going to develop, and not because they're not important. They're very important, but time wise, in this short period of time, we're covering huge chunks of history in 12 lessons to do this survey. So Jacob grows, his family grows. He has 12 sons, and eventually he has Benjamin. You remember the story of Joseph in there, and the coat of many colors, and his brothers are jealous. They sell him into slavery. He goes into slavery. He rises up in Potiphar's house because God's with him. Then he gets falsely accused and he's thrown in prison. He rises up there. And then he takes another kind of whack there um, when the servants of the king forget about him after he helped them out with some dreams and so forth. And eventually, when the nation's at the most need, they remember, oh yeah, Joseph, he's back in prison, and they go get him, and he interprets the dreams. They come true. He becomes this powerful man in Egypt. Those are some of the things going on in the background. But let's jump back into Genesis 46 here. And this is God again speaking this time. It says, Then God spoke to Israel in the visions of the night and said, Jacob, Jacob. And he said, Here I am. So he said, I am God, the God of your father. Do not fear to go down to Egypt, for I will make of you a great nation there. I will go down with you to Egypt, and I will surely bring you up again, and Joseph will put his hand on your eyes. Eventually Joseph has these brothers that sold him into slavery come before him because they have no food, they're in famine, they're trying to trade for means. He plays some tricks on them to kind of teach them a lesson, and eventually he reveals who he is. And God comes to Jacob because he sends for Jacob and his younger brother and all this to come to Egypt. And God's assuring him, yes, you need to go, and I'm going to make you a great nation in Egypt, is what he tells him. So you have, and then there's a personal blessing there, being able to see Joseph and Joseph touching him and so forth. Son that he thought was dead. Um, so we have now the family, which is quite large now. You have not only, Jacob and his wives actually, and then his sons, but their wives and their kids and all their servants. And I don't know how many that would be, but it's a pretty good little gang here that move into Egypt, and they're going to be blessed because of Joseph with a very fertile area. It's called Goshen, and it is fed by and watered by the Nile. It's a great place of pasture for these shepherds, and they're just going to grow and become this powerful nation, just as God said they would. Now, we know that when you get into the book of Exodus, there's going to be this Pharaoh that rises up who knows not Joseph and is going to enslave them. But the reason why is because they become this powerful people, and he was afraid of them. But we need to remember that this is what God has said all along. We see the covenant passed from Abraham to Isaac, even going back to Abraham. He said you're going to go in time to Egypt and so forth. He tells Isaac it's not time for you to go to Egypt yet. And then eventually tells Jacob, as he gives him the covenant, that he goes through this life and all these things and events. Eventually, at the end of his life, he says, yeah, now it's time to go into Egypt. We also watch God pass that covenant really into the children of Israel and all that. Remember, it's always the descendants of who are going to reap the ultimate blessings, and the families of the earth. That was also reiterated to Jacob. I'm going to throw this question up, and you already see it. What does the passing of the covenant to Jacob teach us about God? Now, we're taking the lineage here, and what I'm kind of getting at with that question is keep in mind who Jacob was. Isaac seems to be a pretty faithful man, and he does have his fallback, but he appears to be quite a faithful man. But that covenant being passed to Jacob, we already talked about it in the context about Isaac. Remember, making this covenant with you and your descendants because your father Abraham kept my commandments, my statutes. What about it passing from Isaac to Jacob? Okay. Um, there's not a time limit on them. Yeah, that's a good point. Beyond one particular family. Well, right now that it is through this particular family, though. It's going to extend to all the families of the earth, but it's going to be through that particular family. And you're right; it's going to go carry through for centuries. Let me just get you guys to think about something. And we didn't cover this because we don't have time. I'm going to ask for you to kind of draw back into your own study here and think about Jacob. Jacob started off, and his name means usurper. Okay, and that's why I think God gives him another name, Israel. But Jacob and Esau were twins, and they wrestled in the womb. And you might remember that. And Jacob and his mother kind of schemed and planned against Isaac in his old age and stole Esau's blessing. Esau had actually already given up his blessing, but they tricked Isaac into blessing Jacob rather than Esau. Um, he ends up going to Laban's house, and he's kind of trying to play trickery there, but Laban kind of tricks him, and he ends up marrying Leah and then Rachel. He's afraid of Esau when he's coming back to the land and sends up all of his family in front of him and trying to send up all these offerings in front of that and trying to appease Esau because he's afraid Esau's going to try to kill him. And then he wrestles with God and all that. And one of the things I think is important to remember again, this promise wasn't based on Jacob. Jacob was he was a pretty rotten guy for a long time. But it was based on both his those who came before him, Abraham, Isaac. It was based on God, and it was based on those who would come after him. And God's not um, again going to give Jacob the promise or the blessing of that promise because hey, Jacob was such a great and righteous man. And it's really something that just reverberates through Scripture. It's not because we are so righteous, it's because someone else was so righteous. It wasn't because Jacob was so righteous, it was because Abraham was. But it really wasn't because Abraham was so righteous, it was because God was. It's not so righteous because we are so righteous, but because Jesus was. So we walk then in his blessing, not in our own merit. And that's really the discussion. See, that's why these things all tie together. When you get into books like Romans and you get in chapter 3 and 4, and it says, not by works, but by faith, and people argue about that, this is what he's talking about. This is what he's talking about. Okay. That is true, Russell, that God is focused on the repentant man, not the previous lifestyle. That's definitely true because he doesn't give this promise to Jacob until after he's kind of changed his ways. He tried to steal it earlier, but God doesn't give it. You can't steal something from God. God has to give it. But he doesn't actually give it to him until he is that penitent man. That's a good point. But keep in mind too, though, it's not based on his penitence or his repentance. It's based on what he'd already promised to do. But that kind of condition came up to meet that, and God said, "This is now the timing." But that's a really, really good point. All right, let's move to the next little thought here that I want to put out there. We didn't cover this except in a really summary way, but Joseph goes through many trials before becoming a powerful leader in Egypt. You might recount that they first wanted to kill him, then decided not to, and as they ate their lunch and he was down in the hole, they see this band of traders come through and they sell him off. And he goes to Potiphar's house and he does really well. And then Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him. Um, he tries to not give in to her advances, as she makes more advances. Eventually, he has to flee from her, and he's accused of doing something to her. And if I remember the text, Potiphar doesn't even really believe it, but I guess to save face, he puts him in prison. And then, of course, he's in prison, and he rises up. They forget him, all this stuff. I really want to bring that back up because the children of Israel kind of go through a similar pattern. Uh, they're Jacob's family, anyways. They're in a famine, um, and the whole time Joseph is over there in Egypt and he's rising up. They go to Egypt to go to Joseph. He brings them in, and they grow and they're blessed. And then all of a sudden, here comes this Pharaoh, which is a few pharaohs away, but anyway, from Joseph. He doesn't care about Joseph. He doesn't care about the Hebrews. He sees them as a mighty nation that can rise up against them, and he enslaves them. And eventually, Moses is going to come up, and God's going to free them, and they're going to walk out with even the riches of Egypt. And I think this pattern of seeing, whether it's in a person like Joseph or in the nation, that they go through these bad trials and into good, sometimes on their own making, sometimes like Joseph, not of their own making. Um, but that through those things, we can learn something about God, can't we? I think we can. I'm going to put that question up there. Can we learn anything about struggles, even persecution, and the promises of God? This is something that people struggle with, not to repeat the term, quite a bit. We go through something challenging, something faith shattering sometimes, something that makes us doubt, am I faithful enough because these bad things are happening to me? And we look at these stories, and what might we take from the story like Joseph, or even as a nation of Israel, and who God is, and what he's doing through these things? So can we learn anything about struggles, even persecution, the promises of God? Let's see if anyone wants to take that one on. All right. Okay. That's true. We don't know what's on the other side of them. Only God can know. So we have to trust God through them. That's a really good point and a really good perspective when we face some of these things. Might there be something else too, though, in the midst of not just kind of making it through, but is there a value in the midst of the making it through? I guess that's what I'm also looking for. Let me back up and put it another way. In the early life of Joseph, he's a young man. He's favored by his father. He's having these dreams that his not only his brothers will bow down to him, but his young father and mother will bow down to him. And if he just continues on knowing these great things that are going to happen to him, is it possible that Joseph wouldn't be the man that we know him to be when he's the prime minister of Egypt? In other words, was there some value in him going through the hard times that he did? Yeah, I mean, that's true. Sometimes we grow in the midst of these troubles and trials. Um, there is a story, Peter kind of picks up on the picture of that we kind of pass through the fire. And the picture then is kind of smelting metal. When you you smelt metal, when you melt it down, you're melting off and burning off the impurities. You're trying to make it purer and purer and purer. And I'll never forget a story that was shared, and some of you all probably heard this before because I think I've used it actually at Three Forks. Um, but there was a man who was interviewed. This is probably going back a long time ago, but still in the modern age, but not anytime recent um memory. But he was still known for smelting gold by hand and not the kind of corporate processes. And they always there was some reporter coming out, you know how they do, and interviewing him. How do you know when the gold is as pure as it can be? And he makes the mention that he keeps putting it through the fire and burning off impurities until he can see his own reflection in the gold. That's just too easy of a parallel for God, that sometimes maybe we go through the fire so that he can see, more of himself in us, more of Christ in us. And of course, think about Christ's life. Think about all that he went through. Not so that would happen with Christ, but maybe so that we could see the character that we need to develop too. Maybe sometimes only that character can be developed through hard things. All right, a couple of you posted here. Jennifer, God gives us people to help us through our trials and struggles, never leaves us alone throughout the hard times. It always has a purpose and a plan. That's another aspect of it. There is this connection with other people in the midst of our trials. That God, I think Jennifer is kind of getting, or Adam, whoever's commenting here, that God doesn't leave us alone. But keep in mind that other relationships are also built in that too, right? A really good thought. Russell, um, okay. Uh, yeah. And Russell, in that picture of Paul, there's something very specific that's mentioned there, and it's his own humility. Paul said that God left that thorn in his side and did not remove it so that he would remain humble. So there was something within Paul, and Paul recognized it, that if um, God, in the position he was and the power he had, that God made a calculation here in that, allowing Satan to put this thorn in his flesh was for his own benefit. And sometimes we don't hear that. We'd like to think that to our benefit is no struggle, no pain, no trial, but that is a really good example, thinking of Paul there. And kind of in the midst of that, just to make a spiritual reality here, is whether we're talking about Joseph and his attitude or whether we're talking about Paul. Paul said his grace is sufficient. Going even back to what Tiffany said earlier, we got to trust him that his grace is going to be sufficient. All right, one more comment here from Adam. James 1:3, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. And that's really what we're talking about, this building up of our personal faith and character and who we are, that we're being molded. One of the things I think we cannot say too many times, and we cannot reiterate to ourselves and others, is that God has a purpose and plan. Now, it's not always what we think it is. We think of purpose and plan in our life like God has a purpose for me to be a preacher, or God has a purpose for me to be happy, or God has he never really says any of that, does he? He says, blessed are those who do certain things. And some are called to be, and some have gifts and so forth in other places. But he never really says that's what his purpose is. The only time he says what his purpose is really is in Romans 8, that we should be conformed to the image of his son. So there is something else going on, and sometimes in the midst of our struggles, um, it doesn't make the struggle easier per se, but it does give us perspective, to remember that God has something else in mind, even the likeness of his son in us. All right. If you have any more questions or comments over the lesson tonight, feel free to put them in the chat. I'd love to hear them, love to read them, I guess is best. I think they add an element to our study together. I hope that you agree. And as you're doing that, and as you're maybe having more questions, I'm just going to kind of recount what's coming up in the class, because I know there's a little bit of delay as well. But next week we're going to be looking at lesson 8, the giving of the law. So we're going to be looking at the law of Moses. We will kind of catch up in between, them going into Egypt. We'll talk about what happens there, and the plagues and coming out, but we're going to really focus in on that law, what it means, what it stands for, its purpose. That will be the bulk of what we're looking at. So if you're expecting a lesson on the 10 plagues, you're not going to get that next week, but feel free to go back and study that. We're just going to kind of summarize and go over those things as we're looking at this survey. Now, we will look at those things in other courses, other classes, But we want to keep this, on a quick pace here as we connect these events to each other and leading up to our study or survey of the New Testament. All right. Was there any more thoughts or comments or questions then? Ooh, got the big picture of me up now. Um, as we kind of bring our class to a close tonight, I just want to again just remind you, if you're in the classroom, if you've not been in the classroom, you haven't been doing the discussion work, you're an audit student, you think, well, I haven't done it from you want to jump in and start working on that work this week. Hey, that's great. Anything you add to the discussion is going to be to your benefit and to all of ours in the class. So don't let the fact that you didn't do previous work stop you from doing work now or going forward. We'd love to have you as part of that discussion. For our credit students, just remember, if you've not got your 2 replies in from last week, you need to make sure you have those done, your original 2 from last week, so I can get those graded back to you. And of course, this week you have your question up as well as your 2 replies that are required. Also, just keep in mind that end paper. I really want to encourage you. I know if it weren't for the last minute, right? But your paper will be a whole lot better if you give it some time and give it some thought and you give it some planning. So I would really encourage you to do so. But that's coming up. That'll be at the end of the class. It'll be due a week after class ends, and I'll get something more official up on the website for that. All right. I'm not seeing anything more from you guys. I hope that you enjoyed class tonight. Would really encourage you to go back, make sure you review the text this week, review the scriptures. We just kind of quickly went through some of those. I've encouraged whole chapters of reading and really would like to encourage you to go back and read those because that's where you're going to get the most from. Not from me, but from the text. So go back and read those as you have opportunity this week and make this study enriching to your life that way. I am going to throw up the Three Forks Bible Institute screen. This class is officially closed for tonight. Appreciate everybody being a part. If you have some questions, I'm keeping the live feed open just for a little bit longer so that I can remark on those or in the chat. But otherwise, we'll see you guys in the next class. Thank you, guys.